We are incredibly excited today to be kicking off our very first HBO USC Annenberg partnership in a series that we are calling the Diverse Voices Forums. These are going to run for the entire academic year, designed to examine the ways in which the creative community, in this case, the creative force of HBO, enlists diverse talent in front of and behind the camera, and explores diverse perspectives in series and programs that are not just critically acclaimed, but also popular. The forum, Diverse Voices Forum, launches today with our first guest, David Simon, who is a journalist, an author, a writer, producer, and co-creator of the current dramatic series, The Deuce, in conversation with our own Professor Taj Fraser. We're also really excited to announce the second in our series, which will be Issa Rae, the star of HBO's Insecure, and that will be November 13th. So please stay tuned for details, and we'll continue to announce the others in the series as we put them together and schedule them. What we hope to do with this series is to shine a spotlight on creative content, on storytelling, and frankly, creative talent that shape the industry today and are leading us into its future, and to drive important conversations around diversity and inclusion in the entertainment industry. We all know too well here at USC Annenberg the extent to which Hollywood lacks diversity, because we study it ourselves. Our faculty, some of them sitting right in front of me and alongside of me, are thought leaders on the topics of race and gender and representation in media. And our very own Stacy Smith, as you all know, is, go ahead, shout out. You can shout out to Sarah Benet Weiser here, also one of our gender. I'm gonna cite Stacy's work because barely a day goes by when somebody doesn't cite Stacy's work because of how relevant and significant it is. According to her research, we see 2.18 males for every one female character on screen, a statistic that has not actually changed in the past 9 or so years. In terms of racial diversity, only around 30% of characters from underrepresented groups are present, well below the US Census. And 1 in 4 of the top films of 2016 did not feature a single African-American or Black-speaking character on screen. But supported by that kind of data, true, factual, accurate data, we hope to encourage dialogue about diversity in creative industries, and frankly, we hope to change the paradigm, to move beyond quantifying the problem and head in the direction of meaningful and sustained solutions. You all are going to be leaders in the media and the entertainment industry of the future, and we think that it is critical that you all consider the role of creative storytelling from different perspectives. And all the more important when we think about creative, sustainable solutions for a more representative worldview. So we're thrilled to form and strengthen partnerships with industry leaders like HBO. So a huge thank you to HBO for taking this journey with us. Today, Professor Taj Fraser, who's also the director of IDEA, is going to look at HBO's role in amplifying voices of difference in a conversation with David Simon, the acclaimed co-creator of The Deuce. Some of the questions that they're going to be considering are, how does a creative force like HBO enlist diverse talent in front of and behind the camera? How do diverse series like HBO's The Wire and The Deuce challenge viewers to see the world through a different lens than they may be accustomed to? What you may not know about David is that David has covered stories as a journalist, working for 12 years at the Baltimore Sun on the city desk. So he's able to combine many of our disciplines here in one career. And then with The Wire, David showed us different perspectives on an issue, which really is the definition of diversity. And at that time with that series gave us a look at the cop criminal dynamic, sort of that familiar trope from the other side, offering unique and different dimensions. So as you'll see, he looks at topics that are central to diversity in different urban settings through his books, his written work, and his television series. So please join me in welcoming David Simon of HBO in conversation with our very own Professor Taj Fraser. Thank you.
I think we're gonna get sorry, quick picture. Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dean Bay. We appreciate it.
I just say it's always good to begin a diversity seminar or a series of them with the white guy. I feel is
right in the middle too.
Yeah, you know? I feel particularly honored.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely honored. I've just come from teaching my class, Race and Ethnicity and Entertainment in the Arts, and our guest was David Simon. So I'm on a particular kind of high in terms of just the quality of the exchange, and as well for what we're going to experience over the course of the next hour. Mr. Simon, through news reporting, nonfiction, authorship, and of course television, you have created worlds that explore difficult subject matter. In particular, the ongoing histories of racism, class inequity, and most recently, gender oppression and pornography, made up of diverse characters that disrupt stereotypical conventions of race, gender, and class. Your works illuminate what you once described as, quote, the simple, raw vulnerability of lived experience, end quote. It's a pleasure to have you here with us and be in your company. Can we give him another round of applause?
Thank you.
So I'm sure many of us in this room know you, through your work as a television producer and writer. But sitting here, in this building with the media center right here, I thought it felt fitting to begin with a discussion of your first career as a crime reporter for the Baltimore Sun, where you worked actually with one of Annenberg's own, our illustrious colleague, Professor Diane Winston. So she told me to tell you hello. She's actually traveling right now.
That's right.
So my first question is, what drew you to journalism as a profession, as a practice? What stimulated your hunger for the profession?
Wow. You got to remember, I was in junior high school and high school when Watergate was happening, and it was really a local story to Washington. I grew up just over the D.C. line in Maryland, and that extended police story that was the Washington Post chasing Nixon was a daily adventure in newspaper reading for myself. And it actually, I'm not unique here. I mean, the journalism schools, when I went to college in '78, journalism school had been packed for since '76 on, it was like double the enrollment. Suddenly all the kids that they were going into comp-sci and engineering a moment earlier, they all wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. It ended, I mean, by '82, I think everyone had moved on, but there was this lump of people who wanted to be journalists. But I sort of had a little bit of the virus in my home life because my father had trained in journalism at NYU. He'd been very briefly worked at the Hudson County Dispatch in Jersey City. And then the war came, and after the war, he went into public relations, which was paying better, and my brother had been born. And so he never got that newspaper career. But I grew up in a house where we took every newspaper and where the stories he told and the affections that he had for writing were all very much about newspapering. I mean, we argued about stuff that, no sentient humans should argue about at the dinner table, like, the pitfalls of the gerund lead, that kind of stuff. But there were a lot of reporters who came. He was the PR director for a Jewish service organization called B'nai B'rith, which had its headquarters in D.C. And so there were a lot of reporters, a lot of them religious reporters or, Israeli journalists. But like the religion reporter to the New York Times Pat Spiegel for years and years. He was my Uncle Pat, Irving Spiegel. And they were all characters. They were all like hilarious, off-center characters. It was a different time in newspapering. By the time I got to my own newspaper, by the time I got to the Baltimore Sun, I thought, I know you people. I know how crazy, and nobody was like that. They were all like guys with mortgages, and journalism degrees. But there was a moment where I thought, man, what a life to go see things, see a new thing every day, and then just bring it back to the campfire and tell the world about it. It's like you don't have to pick a career. You get to see something different every day. It just sounded like a lot of fun. And then the Watergate thing on top of that made me feel like, oh, and maybe there's even a purpose. So I just went to college looking to get on my college paper, and I never really had a plan beyond that.
Can you retell the story you told to some of my students about the end of kind of your college experience and how you transitioned from?
All right, I went to College Park. I went to University of Maryland at College Park. It was a huge school, bigger than yours actually, if you can imagine such a thing. Something keeps banging here. Anyway, they had my grades in high school. I knew I was going there, and I was in state, so I didn't even need good grades. So I'd edited the high school paper, which was, but I got there and, with my 2.5 grade point average, and they let you right into the journalism school, and it was packed. But what the academics might have been suspect, but they had a broadsheet 12-page daily newspaper called the Diamondback, which was among the best in the country. And it had a temperature. The demeanor of the staff of the Diamondback was, and I mean this in all due sincerity, it was, fuck you. It was the most beautiful, like I've never had as much fun in journalism as I had the 3 years I worked on my college paper. They took on the university administration. They were belligerent. They were arrogant. They published the grade point averages, the failing grade point averages of the entire basketball team, and got sued by the university and won. The editor the year before I got there was revealed to not even be a student. He had stopped registering for courses because the job was really 60 hours a week publishing the paper, and he didn't have time. And they fired him. The board had to fire him. And then they propped up another guy as the pretend editor, and he continued to show up every day and edited the paper for the rest of the year. That attitude is basically, Mencken said journalism is the foam from the lip of a mad dog. So that was it. I was like, okay. Anyway, I worked there 3 years. I ran for editor. I was editor-in-chief. I failed out of the college 3 successive semesters in a row. By this time, you had to register as a full-time student, and so I did, and I couldn't withdraw from the classes while I was editing the paper, but nor did I go to the classes. So for 3 successive semesters, I wrote to the faculty board saying, please, if you readmit me, I won't go near the college paper, and they did, and so I finished my year, and then they admitted me again, and I started my 5th year of college with about 70 credits. And since I had another year at least and many summer sessions to get out, I became the stringer for the Baltimore Sun, which was the largest paper in Maryland, but was 35 miles to the north. So they needed somebody locally to cover the campus, which was like a small city, much like USC. And so I covered the campus and the Washington suburbs for the Sun, they paid me by the story, $40, $60 a story. And I lived like that until I wrote my way on the paper. And that brought me to Baltimore. So it was like, if I look back on my college career, the academics are hilarious. If you looked at my 120 credits to see how he got out, I'm sure the University of Maryland would lose accreditation. But the editing the Diamondback was really like grad school. I mean, I came to the Sun sort of fully formed as somebody who could be a Metro reporter.
What was it like making that transition to the Sun, having grown up right outside of D.C. and now kind of moving?
I grew up in a lefty Democratic household, New Deal people, Jewish, argument was sport in my house. We argued at the dinner table about everything. It was all good. It was all good argument. That's how you got attention in my family, was by being able to argue both sides of any issue. But it was a predominantly white, it was Montgomery County, Maryland. I grew up in Silver Spring, very affluent county. I was sort of in the not affluent part of it, but it was still perfectly middle class. Predominantly white. And then I got hired at the Baltimore Sun and made the night police reporter, the 4 to 1 guy, in a city that was majority black. And everything was different. Plus, in a weird way, we didn't talk about this, but DC was a much more liberalized world because of the presence of the federal government. And you know, from being from DC and Baltimore, I felt like I'd gone south when I went to Baltimore. You know, I can tell you that maybe twice in my entire life I heard the N-word spoken in my actual life in Montgomery County. And I remember it because it was like a moment. Whereas the moment I walked into a white working class bar in Dundalk or in Highlandtown, it was just a commonality. Race was out in the open in a way that it wasn't in my childhood. So it's like I walked into this other world, and you went to work.
From what I've read, you were extremely ambitious and driven in your first years at the Sun. What did it say? I think I read you produced over 300 bylines by your year, or at least that's what folks.
But of course, if you produce 300 bylines, 240 of them are shit.
Well, I didn't say it. You did.
But it was like, it was all police said yesterday. And by the way, you're learning the city. But you're learning which roads go where. And I mean, I can tell you the first night that I was on night police, I had 2 shootings in the 700 block of George Street. And like there's always the question is, do I go out? Is it a big enough story that I should get in the car and go out, or do I work it by phone, or is it just a brief? And what am I, So I took it to the night editor. I said, I have 2 shootings in the 700 block of George Street. And the guy looked at me real weary. And he said, that's the Murphy Homes. When you don't have a shooting in the 700 block of Street, come talk to me. It was that cynical. It's like I didn't even know the terrain. So that for the first couple of years was just figuring out. It's figuring out how to convince a belligerent desk sergeant to give you a report that you have every right to. Like that's the first couple of years are just that.
Okay. In your time with the Sun, you authored 2 books, Homicide and The Corner, both of which were transformed into a television series as well as an HBO miniseries.
Yeah, that was incredible.
And after these 2 programs, you end up kind of leaving the Sun and going full-time into television. How did you make that, what made you decide to make that transition, that leap?
There was no plan. Homicide was a year I spent in the homicide unit following a shift of detectives. And it wasn't selling. The film rights weren't selling. So I had one brilliant moment of clairvoyance. I said, Barry Levinson, he's from Baltimore, right? He made all those Baltimore movies, I like Diner. Send Barry the book. Maybe he'll, And this is me talking to, some guy in the basement of CAA who has, trying to just unload it for some option money. And so they sent it to Barry, and he made it into the NBC show, Homicide. And they actually came to me and they said, would you like to try to write the pilot? And I said, no. I don't know. No. Get somebody who knows what they're doing. So they did. And somewhere in that first season, they came back to me and they said, I said, if we show you a couple of the scripts, maybe you want to try to write off of that template. So I did. And the first script I wrote was with a friend, David Mills, an African-American writer from the Diamondback, who was at that point at the Washington Post. And he was the guy who, when we were putting out the college paper, he would stop putting out his pages to go watch Hill Street Blues. Like 10 o'clock Thursday night, it was like, I can't do those headlines. I got to go. I was like, David, but like he was like, no, man, this is like good. There's actually television and it's good. I wasn't into it, but he was. So when they gave me the script assignment, I said, I'm going to call David again. So we sat down, we wrote the script in 2 weeks, and Robin Williams was in it. I don't know if anyone saw this old episode, but Robin Williams agreed to do an episode of Homicide. At that time, film actors didn't do television. And it won the WGA award. And about half of the stuff was still ours. Half of it was Tom Fontana and Jimmy Yashimura writing over top of us because we sort of half knew what we were doing, but not really. And So David like immediately quit the Washington Post and went out here and said to me, you know, because I said, no, this is like some weird stepchild that you can't believe in. He said to me, you're an idiot, and a door just opened whether you realize it or not. So he got jobs on network shows, and at some point, my newspaper started going south as newspapers, chain ownership, out-of-town editors who didn't really give a shit about Baltimore. I mean, a lot of bad stuff started happening. And at the same time, they were offering buyouts to veteran reporters. This is before the internet, by the way. This is when newspapers were incredibly profitable, but they had gone to Wall Street, and Wall Street had figured out that if you publish a shittier newspaper with a smaller news hole and junior reporters and less staff and less coverage, you'll make more money. And they were absolutely right for a time until the internet arrived. So that was happening, and I took a buyout, and I went to work on the Homicide show because at some point I took another script assignment, and this one, they didn't rewrite it all. And so I ended up writing in television and not believing in it. I was like, well, this is a good gig that pays really well, but I'm going to finish my second book, and then I'm going to go to a better newspaper. And that was the plan. I was going to, I had a standing offer from the Washington Post. I was going to go back to my hometown and work at the Post. And then the second book came out, and Tom Fontana, who had been the showrunner of Homicide, he had just done the show Oz, which is now 20 years old, 25?
About that, right?
20. We just had the anniversary for it in New York. And I thought the second book, which was about a year I'd spent on a drug corner, had no chance of being made into television. But if you'd seen Oz, I saw the pilot of Oz, I was like, these guys at HBO, they're crazy. They'll put anything on TV. They'll put anything. I just watched somebody like tattoo a SWAT stick on a guy's ass. Drug corner, no problem. So Tom actually set up the meeting for me at HBO, and that was, and still I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to do this as a miniseries, but then I'm going to go back to the Post. And then somewhere after that, Carolyn Strauss of HBO walked up and she says, you got anything else? You got anything that could be a series? As a matter of fact, and I mean, somewhere around the third, fourth season of The Wire, I had to admit maybe I wasn't going back to a newspaper.
Right.
So you see, I mean, honestly, no plan. No,
it's a good, to me, example to our students of, to some degree, being passionate about your craft and dedicated to it, and to some degree having to adapt yourself to opportunities and changes, especially changes in the industry where you imagined yourself.
Right. I mean, the Sun literally had to show me the door and say, here's a year's salary. We're reducing the newsroom by 120 people. Do you want to go or not? And I mean, I could have stayed, but like, I had this offer. I thought I was going to another newspaper. It was like, I'm going to take a year's salary, put it in the bank, because this paper's not going anywhere good. So a lot of it was being kicked in the ass rather than me having a plan.
Over the past 20 years, HBO, you all have revolutionized really how many of us watch television through shows like Oz, The Sopranos, and then later, miniseries such as The Corner, or Show Me a Hero, or Generation Kill, or television dramas like Treme, or The Wire. You stated that one of the early challenges for you was, in terms of bringing these shows and stories to television, was teaching folks how to watch television differently. You said that is to approach television as a medium for serious storytelling that speaks to and grapples with our current conditions and the contradictions of our immediate world. Can you elaborate about that challenge? Do you still find that to be a challenge? How much of a challenge was that early on?
For me, it's still a challenge, which is to say, the things that work in television, that we know work, and we discussed this earlier in the class, there's three metrics by which you can gauge whether a television show is going to find an immediate audience and be able to maintain it. One of which is violence, people shooting other people, cutting other people, blowing shit up. The second thing is, pretty people fucking. That works. And the third thing is comedy. I mean, if something's funny, it's funny. And people, the release of comedy on television is a powerful force. If you don't have a show that can, definitively rely on those three metrics, those three currencies, I guess I should say, it's always an uphill struggle. So if you want to be hyperbolic in your use of violence or sex, or be very broad in your comedy, you're probably trading in a way that can sustain a franchise. For me, I come out of prose. So the first, the rap on me is, I don't know what's going on with this show. I've watched 4 hours. I don't know where it's going. It's slow. To me, I'm writing the first chapters of a multi-POV novel. It's like, think of any book you ever wrote and go back and look at, or ever read and cared about, and see what happens in the first few chapters and see what doesn't happen. It's like I'm always planning for the last 20 minutes of the last episode. That's not a good model for keeping people around till the last episode. They have to trust you implicitly that you know what you're doing. And nobody trusts anybody. So you go back to every single review of everything we've ever done, and it's always been like, the critics slowly dragging it, unless you send them all the episodes in advance. We've learned to do that. But, I'm always writing at a pace that is not the pace of television. It's the pace I take the idea that I'm doing a long-form story seriously. And I came up on a show, a very well-written show, written by a bunch of playwrights, Homicide, but it was 22 playlets. Sometimes 1 or 2 would be connected, part 1, part 2, but mostly the story stopped at the end. By the last commercial break, story over, next week we'll do something different. And so it was like, it wasn't a novel. It wasn't Portrait of an Artist or Ulysses. It was Dubliners. It was a series of connected short stories in a world, but nobody had to build anything out. And to credit Tom again, Oz was this moment where they gave me 8 hours, I'm building one story. And at that point, television could be a little more grown up. Now you can sort of build something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and pays out so that you actually care about what happens to these characters because you followed them on a real life scale. And at that point, television got a lot more interesting to me. The other thing that HBO did was they didn't have any advertisers because, the problem with broadcast is, they're reliant
upon trying to get your eyes in between.
That's right. They're there. The programming is there to sell, Lincoln Continentals and blue jeans and iPods and
McConaughey.
Yeah, and so, there's that's not a grown-up medium, because nothing was funnier than watching Tom try to explain why we weren't going to solve a murder on Homicide, or why there would be no redemption at the end, or why we couldn't make these people be friendlier. He'd be talking to some NBC exec saying the show's called Homicide, But listen, if they stop watching, the advertisers are going to, once they got rid of the advertisers and made it about subscription, some grown-up shit could happen.
Okay. Your latest contribution is The Deuce, a show that explores the culture of Times Square during the 1970s and 80s and the legalization and commercialization of sex work and pornography. We actually have a trailer to show of The Deuce. I do want to warn you, there is graphic language and imagery, so if you need to step outside, we'll call you when it's time to come
Who
back.
knew?
Who knew? It's called, exactly. You guys can run it.
I honestly can't watch.
It's your first time in New York?
Does it show?
Yeah, but that's cool. Everyone here came from somewhere else. Where you from?
Minnesota.
Between my expertise and your good looks, thoroughbred like you, we would own this damn street.
Honey, you're not listening. I take care of my own self.
Hey, baby brother. You still betting? I'm a big guy.
Still being funny, Frankie?
Frankie, he owes everybody in New York City. My name's Vincent.
We don't have the cash to cover my brother's debt. We're gonna deliver.
I'm gonna hold you to that.
Mom, hey.
I'm not his mother. He needs you.
I'm doing the best I can.
There are other ways to get by, Says the bread girl who only has to shake her ass for tips. Did your daddy pay for your college?
So what?
Daddy's husbands and pimps, they're all the same.
Every corner between the Deuce and 4-9 has been indicted. If I was you, gentlemen, I would take strong consideration for any offer that moved your ladies off the pavement.
Been running women off the streets for a while now. The parlors are all paying us.
There's enough for all of us to keep a hand in. We could open the Deuce up.
We've called out city corruption before.
This is not news.
Vincent, I got something big on my mind, and I'm beginning to think that you're the man for it.
The center of things now. I'm building something.
The dirty movie's about to open up. Why?
You interested in seeing a movie, Frank?
Lawrence of Arabia or whatever?
Yeah, like that.
Lawrence of Arabia, huh?
But everything that's going on out there, we becoming extraneous in this whole situation. It's about to be the movies or the whole house.
I am not going back to that, ever.
I looked the word prostitute up in the dictionary one time. It says a person who has sex for money. I am not a fool. I want to learn to do what you do. I want to learn how to make movies.
This could be a lot of money. It's not for me. I got enough on my hands.
Precedent no longer guides us. This term pornography defies definition.
There's gonna be real money in it now. Right here, made in the USA.
These personal freedoms are protected by the First and the 14th Amendments.
There's been a change about community standards.
What about community standards?
Apparently, New York has none.
So I have two questions. The first, I'm interested in you elaborating what the Deuce is about in more detail, because it's more, I know it's about, to some degree, the commercialization of pornography, but there's more going on in terms of the transformation of New York. You know, this is a very different Times Square than what we know of Times Square today, right? And I'm also interested in you talking about one of the threads I see between a number of the shows you created, particularly this kind of focus on the city, Baltimore, New Orleans, Yonkers, New York, Times Square, and the communities that shape and kind of make the culture of these spaces. You've said before that you're interested in focusing on the portion of the country that we've discarded, the people that America has left behind. And so I'm wondering why this kind of focus? What compels you to tell these kinds of stories, these histories, in your catalog of work?
I think our POV, our point of view loyalty in all of the storytelling is with, we're often about the way people make a dollar. And we're often about labor and middle management. Those are the people that we tend to have sympathy for in our stories. Even if they're, you know, so they can be doing good things, bad things, but the people who are basically operating within some compact that has been arranged by market capitalism. And in the Deuce, as in some other project, there is a critique of unrestrained capitalism and market logic as being a false and dangerous metric for building a just or viable society. That sounds like to your initial ear, because you're so trained, I think maybe not some of you, but most of us are trained to acknowledge capitalism as being somehow symbiotic or in perfect sympathy with democracy, the idea of free markets, that we can't actually, you hear it and you think you're being addressed by some, I'm a doctrinaire Marxist. And what I'm saying is, since I would sort of date it to 1980 and the decline of organized labor, but I would say that the greatest mistake that the country has made, and the argument that keeps coming up in our writers' meetings, is to mistake profit and maximize profit for being a metric of social progress or of being social or functionality. Capitalism is an incredibly valuable tool for generating mass wealth. It's proven to be more dexterous, its potential for bringing in incredible streams of revenue is unrivaled by anything else that man has ever attempted to do economically. It is in no way a measure of whether or not our society is good or bad. Mistaking one for the other has been our great, the great failure. The libertarian notion that if we let markets do what they will, they'll have some sort of utilitarian benefit for the most of us is batshit crazy. And it's been given great authority in our society by the political class and certainly by capital itself, which has been purchasing the political class as fast as it can. And so I look at a story like this and I'm thinking, okay, whose labor? Who gets paid? Where does the money go? Where does the money not go? Who has a good sinecure? Who has a bad position to occupy? What happens from the street to the top of the food chain? And I don't think enough has been, if you examine the libertarian or free market critiques of society and what they suggest will cure what ails us, it's astonishing that anybody bought into this shit. But the country is finding its way to being separate Americas. And so I think it becomes much more, you see it much more rigorously now that we're after this election cycle. You see what the costs are of leaving behind your middle class and your working class, of allowing the markets to dictate just how many Americas there will be, and who will profit and who will be on the outside of profit. So that's the guts of why to do the Deuce. I mean, there's also some, good, clean American misogyny and sexual exploitation and the commodification of women, which, we hadn't done a lot of gender politics in our other pieces. It was time to do that. And yeah, there's some, we get to, Rufus Thomas gets to be the soundtrack one last time, riding through our, there's a lot of fun to be made in doing a show in 1971, but again, that's not the purpose. The purpose is really, this is a critique of market capitalism.
One of the things your shows have been known for, number one, is introducing us to, especially actors of color, in an industry where, in many ways, you don't see them reflected in complex, textured ways. And I know with the Deuce, there's a more explicit focus on gender. I remember in our conversation, I did want to point out that I felt like The Wire, there was also a focus on masculinity, but you said to the exclusion of the other. And I wanted to
I don't think we were ready to write women.
Oh.
We were in our 30s, Like, some of us were not. I'll cop to this, which is like when we started The Wire, I'm not sure I wanted to know what was in the heads of my women characters. I was, I think it was like, we wrote them like men. We wrote the women, the few women that there were in the,
And how has that changed with the production
grow
of the
up.
Deuce?
You grow up. I'm now in my 50s. It's like, okay, maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to, the next Treme was like half the characters were women, and it was like, you know what? If you're gonna write everybody, then write everybody. David Mills, African-American writer who was my first writing partner. He wrote a lot of NYPD Blue, and people would come up and say, I love the way you wrote that scene with Lieutenant Fancy, who's the black character. And I watched him when at venues like this, he would sit there and he'd go, motherfucker, I wrote all the characters. I wrote Sipowicz. I got Sipowicz right here. There was a particular pride in being able to write everybody in a world. And, if you think it's important to have different voices in the room, it's important that your writer's room have everybody and that they can argue and that whoever's in the story, on the Deuce, it's less about race, it's more about women. Women, gay writers, trans writers, get them in the room because this is about the sexual commodification and Times Square and, get what you need for the writer's room. And then the argument's important, but once you go back to write your individual scripts, you want everybody to be able to write everything. You really do. I mean, nobody wants to be like, hi, I'm here to write the Latino scenes, I mean, it's, are we writers or not? And at some point, a commitment to learning the voices of your characters and getting as close as you can. Yes, somebody in the room may say, this line struck me as, this is a lemon right here. Fix this line. But you want to basically have that dialectic where everyone feels responsible for the whole. But I feel like we got on this because you were talking about The Wire, and I feel like, yeah, there's stuff I wouldn't have tried in my 30s that, you get to a point where you're like, you know what, I could be a little bit more curious about this character than I was when I was, 32 years old.
And at least from what I've heard too, you also, I mean, like you mentioned, there are a number of women in the writing room. You've also, I think half the episodes were directed by women. You have executive producers who are women who help.
My producing partner is Nina Noble. The pilot and the last episode were Michelle McLaren. Half the directors were women. Most of our department heads were women. And in the room were Megan Abbott, Lisa Lutz, Will Ralston, who's a transgendered writer. We were very conscious of, we wanted an argument in the room. The room gets better when people argue and feel comfortable in arguing.
What a great point. The room gets better.
Argument is elemental to everything getting better. And it has to be the kind of argument where you can all walk away and come back and do more work.
Right.
But the better ideas have to prevail. You can't be like, I won one, so you get to win one. It's got to be like, fight for what you know is right, and until you're convinced otherwise, keep fighting.
I have one last question for you before we open up. You stated recently in The Guardian that the vernacular of pornography is now embedded in our culture. Even if you're not consuming pornography, you're consuming its logic. It's affected the way men and women look at each other, the way we address each other culturally, sexually. You continue, I don't think you can look at the misogyny that's been evident in this election cycle without paying close attention to how the aggression that's delivered to women is informed by 50 years of the culturalization of pornography. I'm wondering if you can just elaborate a little bit more in terms of, you've also been pretty active in terms of condemning sexual assault.
This is not data. I don't have data.
Yeah.
And it's always been the critique of pornography has always been problematic because, first of all, it's been around for a long time. And I think 15 minutes after the first French guy invented the first camera, he ran down the street to get some Parisian hookers to take their clothes off. I mean, this is true, and certainly prostitution's been around a little earlier than that. So sexual commodification, it's not like it's a metric that suddenly appeared in 1971, but it's become ubiquitous. And I know that, where in my childhood, the sacred hunt for my father's Playboy and where he hid it would, if successful, yield a topless picture of a woman and a letter in the Playboy Advisor that might or might not tell me something about this thing that everyone was talking about called sex. Now it's, a bunch of keystrokes on any computer and a 12-year-old has access to. So I don't think we've done a lot, I don't think we've paid a lot of attention to this revolution that's happened in the last 30, 40 years and what it does mean and what it doesn't mean. I'm a First Amendment guy, I'm a reporter. I don't think there's a censorious solution to this. I do think we need to take a hard look at what we've built and what the costs of it are, because I do think the pornographication of the culture is such that there are now things said in the normal political and public framework to women and about women that men of a previous generation would not have felt secure. I mean, you saw it with what was directed at Clinton. You see it, listen, if you know any woman who has a presence on social media or is an essayist or a journalist or a filmmaker or a musician, look at what people feel comfortable in the anonymity of our media culture dropping on in the comment section of any woman who tries to have an intellectual presence in the society. This is, you can't convince me, and again, I'm operating, because there has been no real aggressive attempt to study this. I don't think it's a data-based supposition on my part, but I believe it. You can't tell me that this ubiquity of what pornography became to the culture, that the way we sell shit, the way we sell shit on Mass Avenue, like stuff that isn't pornographic, nonetheless has all the tropes, you know, a beer commercial. You know, we sell beer and cars, you know, in ways that come to the very cusp of, you know, the pornographic. You can't tell me that at some point it hasn't loosened the strictures by which people feel like they can direct rhetoric and verbiage at women that is astonishingly misogynistic. And that it hasn't had an effect on our political culture. In this last election, I think it was evident. Something's happened, and we've acquired something along the way that we have not attended to, and I think we need to attend to it. So,
I want to make sure we have time to open up for questions. I see one right here and one in the back. We can go to this one right here since proximity.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Leia. I'm a communication senior here. I wanted to know what, as we spoke about, you know, how pornography has had an effect on society and the way we view each other as men and women in a misogynistic society. How do you feel a show like this is going to have an effect on its audience and those who watch it and the way they treat others from then on out?
With all of the stuff that I do, because it's political, we discussed this actually in your class, which is, what I found is, if I write it the way it's supposed to be written, in a sense, without it being either so dogmatic, I tell you what you're supposed to think about the scenes. You know, the characters stand up and give speeches about what's right and wrong, or as it's known, anti-drama. If I write it the way the real world is, I can't prevent viewers on any extremity, on any political or social or cultural extremity, from acquiring what they want to acquire for the right reasons or wrong. I can't write the Deuce for anybody who thinks you can discuss, dramatically depict and discuss, and grapple with the pornographic without introducing nudity or without showing the exploitation of women. Can't be done. On the other hand, I can't prevent the guy who's, you know, oh boy, it's HBO 9 o'clock at night, you know, all I got on is a towel and I can't wait to see this show. I can't write for that son of a bitch. Like, you know, like, if you do, well, no, I'm not gonna, you know, you're not gonna get off on my show, or no, I'm never gonna offend you. I'm doomed. You know, I gotta basically write it as it needs to be depicted. And the trick about writing about pornography, because I don't think the show's particularly erotic or even pornographic, in this way, in what pornography, it's definitely not erotic. The pornographic part, what pornography promises, I think we're trying to thwart, but I'm not sure. And it comes down to frames of film and the mind of every viewer. But what I know for sure is this: if we don't show you enough of what pornography is, and we're not explicit enough, then we're cleaning it up. And all of what we're saying about what it is and why it matters, and what these, you know, what has been done to the sexual franchise of women, we're not making our case right, because we've basically made it all, you know, presentable. What's the big deal? Like, you know, where's the exploitation? If we don't, God damn it, it's this. This is what pornography is. On the other hand, if we show you too much, and we've actually made pornography to critique pornography, then we're full of shit. So somewhere in the middle, and what that comes down to is men and women working on the show, arguing, talking, agreeing on, you know, we need less of that shot and we need more of this, and you can't cut that line of dialogue, that's important, or that line goes two ways, I'm not sure that it's working for you. You know, these are all discussions that have to be collectivized and they have to be drawn out. So it's a trick. But I mean, I found that to be the case with The Wire and Race and The Corner and Race. You know, there are white supremacist websites that have clips of The Corner or The Wire up because they think what it's doing is depicting, you know, they're not seeing anything that we're saying. They're seeing what they want to see. There are libertarians that think, you know, it's saying, you know, there are conservatives that say, this is what happens when the Democrats control Baltimore. You know, it's like everybody, you know, like, I just want to make this show mine. And they do, and you can't control that. The Vice Dean. Well, I want to hear from the Vice Dean.
I'm the Vice Dean, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yeah, I always felt that Vice needed its own academic framework.
I always thought that too. We actually just made it up, and we keep making it up every day. I just wanted to follow up from that and ask you about, I see in your shows, I'm really digging the Deuce in a lot of different ways, and I see in your shows this kind of deep, sort of profound ambivalence about the kinds of things that you're talking about, whether that's the drug trade or pornography and prostitution, and not ambivalence in a way that you haven't made up your mind about how you feel about it, but ambivalence in the sense that you're not moralizing about it in a particular way. And to Leia's question, I think that this is like incredibly important. Television right now in a political climate which is not about ambivalence at all and is about moralizing on all kind of sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah, moralizing, the reason that moralizing is so lethal to public discourse is that it doesn't deal with the human condition. It is basically a framework for oppression. I'm totally down on the idea of drugs as being healthy. I've lost so many friends in Baltimore to an unrelenting drug trade. The ones that have gotten out not because of the war on drugs, but because of their own personal dynamic and certain things that were, certain opportunities or safety hatches that were there in society to rescue people or to be there when people had finally hit bottom. And the ones that didn't get out weren't protected in any way or weren't made valuable by the war on drugs. The only thing I'm interested in when it comes to public policy is the utility of a policy. Does it work or not? If the drug war was draconian and it locked everybody up for 1 million years and it worked, and the rates of addiction went down and the purity levels of heroin and now oxy, but if you could show me that it tangibly worked, we could actually have a discussion. Okay, it's draconian, it's destroying a lot of lives, we're throwing a lot of people away, the prisons are full. What's happening with the population? But they can't even show it works. There's more drug corners in my city now, open air drug markets, than ever before. And that was true at the height of, when the levels of incarceration for drug crimes was the highest in America. So it's like, if you let them talk about, but drugs are bad, or drugs are scary, the drugs will come for your child, or the subtext, which is, they're black, they're Latino, this is their problem, which of course, that one's disappeared with Oxy so fast it makes your head spin. But if you let them use moralizing, they can avoid talking about problems and solutions for the rest of their natural careers as politicians. And the same thing is true for sex work or pornography. That's not to say that letting the markets have their way with human beings and not arraying the reality of vice around sort of humanistic logic is also, that's not saying that's legitimate, but one of the reasons that people can be so abused and so marginalized is when you keep things illegal and when you make the penalty for stuff draconian. Everything you think is going to solve a problem by being hard usually creates a different problem. And my favorite in the entire history of the drug war was, if you deal heroin and second or third, you're 3-time loser, man. 30 years, no parole. Okay, I know what the solution to this is. The guy who's standing out on the corner selling my heroin is 14 years old because he's charged as a juvenile. So, until the penalties reached a point at which people were like, I don't want to go to jail for 30 years. The heroin trade in Baltimore did not have 14-year-old drug dealers until they made it a rational economic and function of criminal law that, you want everybody who's touching the drugs to be juvenile. Congratulations, you just made the drug war eminently worse in Baltimore, Maryland. So, it's like, I'm really interested in that. And the moralizing is just a way of messing that up.
Hi. Kind of going off of the questions before, and about the choice of medium you use, television, and kind of about these the ambivalence of the work. I was wondering how television is a kind of passive mode of consumption, or that's how it's thought of. And my question is kind of with our viewing of television and the kind of perceiving you were talking about how people are going to perceive it as they want to instead of as what you're showing. I was wondering how that perception might turn into glorification, and how that glorification can be, I guess, like abated or diminished in a way that can lead people to show.
Yeah, you just, again, every frame of film, every line of dialogue, and the totality of what you've built, you got to watch them all and say, what have you built, and why, and what's coming through and what's not coming through. And even if you've done everything right, and you've made the choices you've made, and you've argued it out, and you've sort of like, I'm not leaving that in there, that's exploitive, I'm not, we're enjoying that one too much. Even if you make all the right decisions, 20% of the audience, 15%, 25%, I don't know, some portion of the audience, they're a bunch of assholes. And there's nothing you could have done to bring them any closer to their humanity if, with your narrative. And that's just true. And if you write for them, if you try to bring everybody through the keyhole, I'm going to convince a white supremacist that this story he's seeing about the black underclass in Baltimore is not affirming of his preconceived notions about race and class in America. I'm going to bring him through the keyhole. To do that, which is an impossible task, but even if you wanted to try, you would make a piece that was had so much exposition and rationalization written into the character's dialogue. I see why you're out here selling drugs, but it is part of a function of 40 years of hyper-segregation and the abandonment of the cities by federal urban. If you think about the complexity of what has led us to be the America that we are, and of straining that through a single narrative, not only is that bad writing of dialogue, but if a story is about everything, it's about nothing. That's the power of a story. Stories have a beginning and a middle and end, and a certain number of characters take you through them, and they tell their tale, and you move on to the next story. An example in The Deuce would be this. There was an awful lot of racial attention paid to the idea of characters from the black underclass in The Wire, why they ended up on the corners selling drugs, where they came from, who these kids are. And we were very dutiful about addressing it in that story. Here, this is mostly a story about men and women, and misogyny and commodification, and the dynamics of pornography, and what it's done to the way men and women view each other. So the gender arguments in here are paramount. I also had this problem. All the pimps on 8th Avenue, and the girls in New York at that time were heavily pimped, they all happen to be African American. So what do? I can't pause in the middle of it to go, there's a couple of things I can do. I can make my preeminent police officer African American, so there's somebody coming at this who is not, so I expand the world a little bit. But basically, this story cannot be about, in any grand way, about the racial dynamic of the African American underclass. We chase that in other stories. We'll chase it again somewhere else. It's in the same way it can't be about the black middle class, or the white middle class for that matter. It's about Times Square. But again, if a story is about everything, if you pause at every moment to contextualize carefully everything you mean to say politically, you're destroying narrative. There's no way to do it as a writer. So the point of, pick a target, get that right, don't lie about anything else, and write for the sensate viewer who's interested in people and systems and why we are the way we are. And then the people who are never going to get it are never going to get it. And you just can't let them dictate terms.
Thank you, Mr.
That
Simon.
it?
This is actually our time. I mean, if you're willing to take any more, I mean, I don't know what your time is like. I just want to make sure we're.
What's our time?
So thank you again for your time. I think all of us are.
You all right?
Yeah?
This is the man in charge of me.
He's the man in charge.
He tells me where I have to go next.
Schedule. Yeah? Time
to go.
Well, thank you again for your time. We all are admirers, students of your work.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, HBO, for working with us to do this. Thank you, everyone else, for coming. We look forward to seeing you guys hopefully next month, in November, for Easter Ray.